There is a single Greek word in Acts 2, verse 46, that our English Bibles translate as glad. And that translation is not wrong, it's just about a tenth of what the word actually means. The word is agaliasis, and it doesn't mean glad the way you feel glad when traffic is late. It means the kind of joy that makes you leap. It's the same word Luke uses for the baby John the Baptist turning somersaults in Elizabeth's womb. It is irrepressible, overflowing, almost irrational joy. And Luke says this was the atmosphere of the early church at the dinner table, every night, every day. That is either the most attractive thing you've ever heard about a community, or it sounds completely implausible. Either way, I want to spend some time today with the passage that describes it, because I think it tells us something important about where that kind of joy actually comes from. Welcome back to the Dandelion Gospel Podcast. This week we're in Acts 2, verses 42 through 47. The 6-week portrait of the Jerusalem church that Luke gives us after the 3,000 are baptized at Pentecost. We're going to look at 4 Greek words that together describe a way of being together that I think most congregations have never quite achieved, and that most of us are hungry for. Let's get into it. Before we can read Acts 2, 42 through 47 well, we need to know where we are in Luke's story. Acts is the second volume of a 2-volume work. Luke's Gospel is volume 1, Acts is volume 2. They were addressed by the same author, addressed to the same reader, a person named Theophilus, and almost certainly meant to be read together. Luke's gospel ends with the risen Jesus commissioning the disciples and ascending into heaven. Acts begins exactly where the gospel ends. Now, Acts was written by the same author as the Gospel of Luke, a careful literary historian who had access to eyewitness sources and who organized his material with deliberate theological intent. The most likely date is somewhere between 80 and 90 CE. After the destruction of the Jerusalem temple in 70 CE. The author is writing for communities that are geographically scattered and culturally diverse, and one of his central arguments is that this scattering was not an accident. It was part of the plan. The author's model for history is sophisticated. He is not writing a simple chronicle. He selects, shapes, and summarizes, and the summaries are especially important. Acts 2, 42 through 47 is one of 3 major community summaries in the book. The others are at chapter 4, verses 32 through 35, and chapter 5, verses 12 through 16. Each one gives a panoramic snapshot of the community between individual episodes. So here's the shape of the story up to this point. In Acts 2, Peter delivers what is arguably the most consequential sermon in human history. 3,000 people respond. And then, instead of telling us what happened next, what any of those 3,000 people did on a Monday morning, Luke pulls back and gives us a summary, a portrait. This is what a community formed by the resurrection of Jesus looks like. That's the function of our text. It is not a description of a specific event. It is a description of a way of being together. And every word in it is chosen. So let's go straight to the text. They devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching and fellowship, to the breaking of bread and the prayers. Awe came upon everyone because many wonders and signs were being done by the apostles. All who believed were together and had all things in common. They would sell their possessions and goods and distribute the proceeds to all as any had need. Day by day, as they spent much time together in the temple, they broke bread at home and ate their food with glad and generous hearts, praising God and having the goodwill of all the people. And day by day, the Lord added to their number those who were being saved. 6 verses, at least 4 Greek words that reward careful attention. So let's take them one at a time. Proskyterio. This is a Greek compound word from pros, meaning toward, and karterio, which is to be strong or to hold fast, to persist. This is the word behind devoted themselves in verse 42. It is not a casual word. Proskyterio means to hold on steadfastly towards something, to keep showing up for it even when the initial enthusiasm has faded. Luke uses this word at several other crucial moments in Acts. The disciples proskyterio in prayer before Pentecost back in Acts 1:14. The apostles say they will proskyterio to prayer and the ministry of the word in Acts 6 verse 4. Even Paul uses a related form in Romans 12:12 to persevere in prayer. Every time the word appears, it describes a kind of sustained, purposeful orientation towards something. Not a feeling, a direction, a choice made repeatedly to keep showing up. Here is the pastoral implication. Luke is not describing a community that was always emotionally energized or spiritually enthusiastic. He is describing a community that was committed. There's a difference between devotion as a feeling and devotion as a practice. And this distinction matters, I think, because we live in a moment where spiritual experience is often expected to be emotionally intense. If worship doesn't move us, if prayer feels dry, if the Bible seems like work, we sometimes wonder whether something is wrong with us. I've watched this happen in congregation after congregation over 12 years of ministry. People who are actually showing up, doing the work, holding on, and spending energy wondering whether they're doing it wrong because it doesn't feel like they expected it to feel. Proskyterio says the showing up is the devotion. The feeling follows the practice, not the other way around. The early church wasn't devoted to teaching, fellowship, bread, and prayer because it was always easy or immediately rewarding. It held on steadfastly because these were the things that kept the community tethered to the risen Christ. Devotion is not an emotional state. It's a structured orientation. Koinonia. This Greek noun comes from koinos, meaning common or shared, and is typically translated as fellowship. This is the second of the 4 marks in verse 42, teaching, fellowship, breaking of bread, and prayers. The English word fellowship has become so diluted. We use it for potluck suppers and coffee hours that it barely carries the weight of what Luke means here. Koinonia comes from koinos, the word for common. It means a genuine sharing of something held in common. In the New Testament, it is used for sharing in the gospel, Philippians 1 verse 5, or sharing in suffering, Philippians 3 verse 10, or sharing in the Spirit, Philippians 2 verse 1. And crucially, the sharing of material resources that Luke describes in verses 44 and 45. This is important. When Luke says they had all things in common, the Greek phrase is hapanta koina. All things were shared. Koinonia is not a feeling of warmth toward other people. It is a structural reality in which people hold their resources, their time, their money, their homes, their lives in a posture of openness toward one another. Paul uses koinonia in 2 Corinthians 9, verse 13, to describe the collection he is organizing for the Jerusalem church, a very concrete financial act of solidarity. This is not metaphorical, it's material. And a word about the common possessions passage, because I know it raises questions. Is Luke describing socialism? Is he prescribing a specific economic system? The answer, I think, is no. Luke is describing a specific community in a specific moment. The Jerusalem church at Pentecost was flooded with pilgrims from across the diaspora who had traveled long distances for the festival and were now unexpectedly staying because they'd become new believers. Many of them didn't have homes in Jerusalem. They needed food, housing, and a community that could hold them while they figured out what their new faith meant. The response of the Jerusalem church was, we open everything up, not as a permanent restructuring of the economy, but as a response to urgent human need. Koinonia made material. Now, Paul's letters reveal that within a generation, the Jerusalem church became the recipient of generosity rather than its primary model. The Gentile congregations Paul founded took up collections for the Jerusalem community, which was apparently struggling economically. This is worth knowing because it shows the early church was not operating from a single fixed economic blueprint. What was common was the underlying principle. No one in the community should lack what they need. The mechanisms changed, the commitments didn't. See 2 Corinthians chapters 8 and 9 for Paul's most extended treatment of this. 2 full chapters on the theology and practice of generosity. It's some of the most pastorally rich writing in the New Testament. Agaliasis. Oh, I got it right that time. From agaliao, which means to exult or to leap for joy. Translated in verse 46 as gladness. This is the word behind glad and generous hearts in verse 46, and it is considerably stronger than the English word glad suggests. Agaliasis is exuberant, irrepressible joy. Luke uses the same word when the baby John the Baptist leaps in Elizabeth's womb at the sound of Mary's greeting found in Luke 1, verse 44. He uses it again in Mary's Magnificat. My spirit rejoices, agaliao, in God my Savior, Luke 1, verse 47. Jude uses it in his closing doxology. To him who is able to keep you from falling and to present you blameless before the presence of his glory with great joy, aliagasis, Jude 1:24. This is not polite contentment. This is not the mild satisfaction of a well-run church program. This is the kind of joy that bubbles over, that makes people around you notice that something is different about you. And Luke tells us this joy is the posture of the community at the table. When they broke bread together in the temple courts and in homes, agaliasis was the atmosphere. This might be the most challenging word in the whole passage for a lot of congregations. You can organize teaching, you can schedule fellowship events, you can implement a giving program, but agaliasis, that quality of irrepressible, overflowing joy at the table, you can't program for that. It's a fruit. It grows from somewhere. And Luke is quietly telling us where. The community's joy flowed from its tethering to the risen Christ, from the teaching, the shared life, the table, the prayers. Agaliasis was not a target they aimed for. It was the natural overflow of a community genuinely oriented toward the right things. And then there's kath hemeron, a Greek phrase that literally means according to the day, or it might be phrased as day by day, as found in verses 46 and 47. Day by day, as they spent much time together in the temple, and day by day the Lord added to their number. It's easy to read past this, but Luke is making a deliberate point about the rhythm of the community's life. This is not occasional. This is not weekly. This is daily. The word for day here is hemera, and the phrase kath hemeron, day by day, appears repeatedly in Luke's writing to describe the regular, sustained rhythms that define a community. Jesus teaches in the temple day by day in Luke 19:47 and 22:53. The disciples are to take up their cross day by day in Luke 9:23. Luke is telling us that the life of the early church was not organized around occasional peaks of intensity. It was a daily pattern, steady, regular, kathameron, and the growth of the community, the Lord adding to their number, was also a daily reality, not the result of a single evangelism event or campaign. I want to sit with this for a moment, because I think it challenges a very common assumption about church growth. Luke does not tell us the Jerusalem church grew because it had a compelling vision statement. He does not tell us it hired the right staff, designed the right programs, or optimized its marketing. He tells us it grew because of a quality of life that was visible enough that people on the outside noticed. The Greek phrase translated having the goodwill of all the people in verse 47 is in contes ekcharin, pros holon ton leon. Phew! Literally, having favor with all the people. The community was generating goodwill in Jerusalem simply by being what it was. Daily. Kevhemeron. Now, I want to pull back and look at the whole portrait Luke has painted in these 6 verses, and then follow 2 of the threads that connect it to the other Sunday texts. What Luke has described in Acts 2:42 through 47 is a community defined by 4 marks: teaching, koinonia, table, and prayer. These are not programs, they're postures, and the community's economic generosity, its selling of possessions and distribution to the needy, is not listed as a 5th item. It is the overflow of koinonia, the material form that shared life takes when it is functioning as it should. The community grows not from strategy, but from agaliasis, from the quality of gladness at the table that makes people on the outside lean in and ask, what's different? This is the dandelion image from Sunday. The dandelion doesn't grow through concrete by pursuing a growth strategy. It grows because it is alive, rooted, nourished. The Jerusalem church grew the same way. One of the supporting texts for this Sunday is Psalm 23, the great shepherd psalm, and the connection to Acts 2 runs right through the table. Psalm 23 says, "You prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies." This is not incidental. In the ancient Near East, sharing a meal was one of the most significant acts of solidarity and protection available. To be invited to someone's table was to be brought inside their circle of care. The Good Shepherd of Psalm 23 is the same one Jesus claims to be in John 10. "I am the Good Shepherd. I know my own, and my own know me." And the table that shepherd sets is the one the early church extends in Acts 2, verse 46, breaking bread at home day by day with glad and generous hearts. This is the theological chain. Psalm 23's shepherd prepares a table. Jesus, the Good Shepherd of John 10, is the host. The community of Acts 2 extends that table outward into the city. The church is the table the shepherd sets for the neighborhood. That image, the church as the table the Good Shepherd sets for the neighborhood, is one I want to carry for a while, because it reframes the question we usually ask about church. We usually ask, how do we attract people? How do we grow? How do we make our church more visible? The shepherd's question is simpler. Is there food? Is the table open? Is there room? The third supporting text, 1 John 3, verses 16 through 18, is in many ways the theological spine underneath the whole Acts passage. John writes, "We know love by this, that he laid down his life for us, and we ought to lay down our lives for the brothers and sisters." How does God's love abide in anyone who has the world's goods, sees a brother and sister in need, and yet refuses to help? Little children, let us love not in word and speech, but in deed and truth. Notice the structure. John begins with the cross, with God's love made visible in the most extreme possible act of self-giving. And then he argues, if that is what love looks like, then love cannot remain purely interior or verbal. It must become material. It must become deed. This is exactly what Luke shows happening in Acts 2. The community has encountered the risen Jesus, who laid down his life and took it up again. And that encounter produces organically a community that holds its possessions with open hands. The resurrection creates generosity. Koinonia is love made material. The question Acts 2 and 1 John 3 are asking together is not, are we doing exactly what the Jerusalem church did? The question is, does our love have any material consequence at all? Is our care for one another producing any change in how we hold our resources? That is a question every congregation has to sit with in its own context. But Acts 2 and 1 John 3 agree that a community where love is only verbal, where no one's pantry or wallet or schedule is affected by belonging to this group, is not yet living the life Luke is describing. Here's the question I'd invite you to sit with before this coming Sunday. Luke describes the early church as a community that had the goodwill of all the people, not the approval of the powerful, not the endorsement of the institution, the goodwill of the people, of ordinary residents of Jerusalem who watched this community and concluded that it was doing something for the neighborhood. To the people with manicured lawns and settled order, the church was probably inconvenient, something growing where it wasn't planted, a weed. But to people who were hungry, lonely, afraid, or simply in need of belonging, the church was the most nourishing thing in the city. That's the dandelion image in its community form. Not a single seed blowing through a crack, but an entire community that has taken root in the city and is simply being what it is: nourishing, generous, daily, glad. The question Acts 2 asks is not, are we growing? The question is, are we useful? Are we the kind of community that people on the outside notice, not because of our programs or our building, but because of the quality of life they can see when they look through the window? That's worth sitting with. Here's what I'd encourage this week. Open your Bible and read Acts 2:42 through 47. Takes about 90 seconds. Read it slowly, carrying 4 things with you: proskyterio, koinonia, agaliasis, kathemeron, devotion, shared life, exuberant joy, daily rhythm. Ask yourself, which of these 4 is most present in my spiritual life right now? And which one am I most hungry for? If a question came up this week about any of the words, the history, the connection to 1 John or Psalm 23, send it my way or put it in the comments. And next Sunday, week 4, we look at scatter, Acts chapter 8. The Jerusalem church faces serious persecution. Most of the congregation is driven out of the city. And what happens? The seeds go everywhere. What looked like a catastrophe turned out to be Pentecost on a larger scale. Come find out. And remember, go where the Spirit sends you. You don't choose the crack in the pavement. You just carry the seed.